Alright, today me, Nicole, and Isabel are going to be talking about Buddhist burials and cremation practices in Japan. The question we'll be talking about today is how and why have Buddhist practices changed over time, and what does each practice reveal about the beliefs regarding death during that time. So we split out into five parts with early Japan, Nara, Edo, Meiji, and post-war period. And the purposes of these practices that we found were that they will help cleanse the body and get the ready for the Pure Land, along with not creating pollution. And the causes of these changes were demographic changes, isolationist culture, COVID-19, and cultural value changes. In the early period of Japan, Buddhism did not arrive yet, so Japanese people had their own treatment of the dead. What they did was they practiced burying instead of cremation. In the Jomon period, bodies were buried in piles of shells and trash on shell mounds, as well as in pits and jars. In the Yayoi period, the bodies were also buried in jars, as well as large extravagant kofu burial mounds if you were rich or important enough. The tossing of bodies in piles of shells and trash greatly contrasts with the sanctity of later Buddhist burial and cremation practices, emphasizing a lack of concern for ideas of like purification and like preparation of the bodies. The significant differences between graves for commoners and the illustrious graves for imperial and political persons illustrates the prevalence of a social hierarchy within ancient Japan. In the Nara Heian period, uh, Buddhism was like beginning to like be introduced in Japan at this time, and with that, there were changing, growing ideas of what Buddhism would be in a Japanese context and how it would be practiced by Japanese people that would not strictly follow Buddhist traditions from other places, and other Buddhists also creating their own practices during this time as it was developing. So during this time period, most Buddhist monks did full body burials. They still did cremation, but it was mostly full body burials. But also at the end of this period, there was a celebrate connection between Buddhism and cremation. Buddhists, Buddhists weren't required to do cremations, but cremation was getting a strong association with being a Buddhist tradition from the cremation of the Buddhist monk Dosho and wanting to follow the cremation of the Shakyamuni Buddha, seeing as a means of becoming a Buddha. So this would help make it more like a popular tradition to do. And so cremation as a practice is believed to purify and not pollute the spirit and to let them become a purified ancestor. Buddhism also started focusing on like the idea of death pollution and like avoiding death pollution by incorporating those ideas within their ceremonies and how they take care of the dead. And then Buddhists also, in the later part of the Heian period, they started to view death as a critical point in escaping samsara and to be reborn within the Pure Land. And other Buddhists were creating their own practices called deathbed practices.
During the Edo or Tokugawa period, with the presence of Christian missionaries, the shogunate wanted to ensure that Christianity didn't spread, so they enacted state Buddhism, where every family had to register with a Buddhist temple. The families would then do their funerals at this temple and would continue the lineage throughout their family history. If you were poor, you were cremated in straw. If you were rich, you were cremated in wood, suggesting a bit of a social hierarchy during this time. There was also an evident concern with contamination from death, and you had to purify yourself after partaking in a funeral, a practice which would continue throughout latter eras in Japan. During the Meiji period, there was a bit of pushback against Buddhism and cremation. However, the ultimate response was that cremation was actually sanitary, safe space, and helped people in ancestor worship, an extremely important aspect of Japanese society and Buddhism. In the Meiji period, there was a bit of a beautification of funerals as they became more illustrious and more of a social event. In the Taisho period, it was a bit of the opposite. They tried to simplify things due to increases in congestion. The Meiji Restoration saw lots of urbanization and new technologies such as cable cars, which made large funerals difficult. Ultimately, it became a mix of like a social event, but a social event that required an increased financial demand on families to pay for the funeral services.
Okay, my name is Isabel, and I'll be talking about post-war and modern practices in Buddhist burial practices. So, despite popular belief, Morihei tradition is still upheld in Japan, although the frequency of it is varying. I will talk about that later. But so mortar tradition involves traditional Buddhist burial practice or funeral rituals. So an example of this would be the family cleansing the body of the deceased, or the family offering snacks at the altar or incense. And some monthly examples or practices of rituals would be priests coming to recite sutras to the dead on the monthly anniversary of the death. But a main factor in burial rituals is the family, and this roots all the way back to the Meiji era. Specifically the Meiji Civil Code, which institutionalized the household system and placed emphasis on male authority and traditional roles. It also stipulated that family grave and altars should be a part of the family estate and that's passed down to the family. This law was eventually abolished, but the idea of also known as the family system, continued on in the new Civil Code in 1948. So, with modernization, there is a question that comes to mind. And that is, how have burial practices changed with shrinking family sizes, such as like people aren't getting married as much anymore, people aren't really having kids as much, or with like single people. So, an example of adaptations to the social change would be Itai Kyobu, which is eternally worship graves at temples, and Jumokuso, which you can be buried under a tree, or Shinzenso, scattering remains of the sea and mountains. So all these methods make care possible without the need for upkeep or living by living family members. So these practices show the deconstruction of belief in modern day Japan, or they show how Buddhist Japanese have adapted to the shrinking family size. Up, we can ask the question, how and why have Buddhist practices changed over time, and what does each practice reveal about the current beliefs regarding death? So in the Nine Han period, Cindy talked about the introduction of Buddhism and cremation, and Buddhism was developing at this time, and cremation was seen as a cleansing process that was required to become a Buddha. And then transitioning into Edo and Tokugawa period, state Buddhism begins to associate between Buddhism and death was seen as impure and could spread like a disease. So this is obviously a very different viewpoint from how the Japanese view death today. And then in the Meiji and Taisho periods, there was initial pushback against cremation, but then that was resolved. And then we see a growth in the participation in funeral rituals outside of family, and the growth of the funeral business and practices. So death is a mournful yet social event, and also people begin to realize that death can be very expensive. And we see reactions to this in the post-war period. So there's a deconstruction of the nuclear family with the modernization of social constructs in Japan, and family no longer plays a huge role in death. And also, regarding the claim that death is expensive, we see newer practices evolving that are much cheaper than the traditional Buddhist burial rituals and practices that can be very expensive. So, why have Buddhist practices changed? So, this could be due to demographic changes, huge population growth, urbanization, and the aging population. So, the average age of the Japanese people is getting older, and that's mainly because we see a trend in younger people not getting married and having kids. So, less marriages, less children being born, isolationist culture, and COVID-19 impacts with all the shut-ins, stuff like that. And then cultural and value changes, stress and responsibility for individuals to keep up family graves, and reevaluating what it means to have a Buddhist death. And there's also a sense of increased individualism becoming popular.